Hello. So in this episode, Data trains his cat, or attempts to train his cat, and doesn't do a really good job. So I put together some footage of how I trained my cats. No. Down. 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 So, they're not perfectly trained. Lillian here still jumps on my desk on my computer sometimes when I'm trying to do stuff, which is annoying. I've been trying to train her not to do that. And Holden over there still bothers Lillian all the time when she's trying to eat, and I'm trying to train him not to do that. And I need to protect my treats and hide them, otherwise Naomi will knock them down off the shelf and rip into them, eat them all. So there's still some things I'm working on, but I think I'm doing a better job than Data because I have trained them not to scratch the furniture. I mean, they do mess up from time to time, but none of the furniture is destroyed because I made sure to have lots of cat trees around that they can scratch up, and they never destroy things like toilet paper or knock stuff off shelves or do anything like that I hear all these other cats doing. So I think I'm doing a pretty good job, so maybe Data should hire me to train Spot. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Force of Nature, which is episode 9 of season 7 of Star Trek Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video I cover the 7th season episode Force of Nature. So Force of Nature is the episode in which Data and Geordi try to train Spot and have conversations about training Spot, while Geordi has some friendly competition with an engineer on another ship. Then the plot finally kicks in that is about a group of scientists who try to warn that warp drive is wearing down space, and this is detected most in this corridor of that all ships had to go through in order to get by the space. So there's a lot of warp travel, and her science is not believed. However, Data and Picard are willing to put in the work and recommend a Federation science ship come out and study the situation. However, that is not good enough for one of the scientists who decides to sacrifice herself with the warp core breach in order to prove her point, and prove her point she does. She creates a rift that traps the medical ship, and the Enterprise must risk itself to try to save the medical ship, and after some surfing and some trials, they finally manage to do that. And then, as the Federation Council decides to put a speed limit on warp drive to warp 5 except for the case of dire emergency. And This, of course, will be forgotten about by the end of the season. Anyway, so I want to start this review by reading from this book, which I don't normally do that, but this is a book of quotes. I rely on this book a lot for a lot of the behind the scenes information that I get about the show. They had a whole section about this episode that I wanted to read. First, let's read from Mr. Ronald D. Moore, who says, Force of nature was something I fought for early on and went to the wall for. We had a big meeting with Rick and Mike and Jerry, and we all got on our high horses, and we went there and said we felt very strongly about this episode, saying we want to do this. We want to make a statement. We want to change the Star Trek universe forever. This is important, and this is the right thing that we should do. Now, I'm just going, what was I thinking? It was such a great idea and concept. We always said that dealing with the environment on this show is incredibly difficult. It's hard to do a show about the ozone because the ozone is a huge and interpersonal and hard to make dramatic. We thought we had found a way to personalize it and make it our problem, and it became force of nature. Now, to quote Brennan Braga, who says, that's an unsuccessful Star Trek episode. It was an analogy for pollution or global warming. The reason that episode is a bore, in my opinion, is that there's no allegory. It's on the nose. It's a fastball down the middle, and it feels preachy. Suddenly, you're not deriving the meaning from the episode. The meaning is clobbering you over the head. And then Mr. Michael Piller, who says, the truth is, I spent so much time on Deep Space Nine, particularly at the beginning of the year, that my involvement with the Next Generation was Monday morning quarterbacking. It made me feel uncomfortable at times, sort of being an absentee landlord coming to collect the rent. I would come in and check the stories and read the scripts and give notes, but I felt the 7th season, my influence was beginning to lessen. It was almost 2 years since I had been in a room with these guys breaking stories, and there are very good people who deserve to be able to try things that they always wanted to do. Force of Nature certainly inspired us to have several long meetings on where the season was going. I felt they were letting it slip away. Alright, so let me turn the page here because I got another quote from Michael Piller. Not directly about this episode, but it's related. I'll get to it. Hold on. So here's the other quote from Michael Piller. There were about 5 episodes in the middle of Season 7 that were as strong as a group of episodes that I've ever been a part of, going from Parallels to Pegasus to Lower Decks, which was really one of the wonderful shows of the year. I also thought that the Beverly Crusher romance with the ghost, Sub Rosa, was a very well executed show. It was a terrific group of episodes. I thought we were doing as well as we possibly could, but the appetite of the season begins to gnaw at you, and finally you say, we have to do a show next week. We're going to do it. So, that last quote was relevant because, yeah, you heard that correctly. He just called Sub Rosa one of the best episodes of the season. It was a group of strong episodes. And this book, including the editor of the book, who has the little notes in between the quotes, pointed to 2 episodes of Season 7 as being the weakest and obviously derived by fans, just like Spock's brain. You guess what those 2 episodes are? This one and Masks. Now, Masks is something I'll get to later. I feel like I'll have to fight a bit harder for that one because, in truth, I like both of these episodes. But I feel like I'm on stronger ground with this one than I am with Masks. They're both kind of guilty pleasures, if I'm being honest. But my point is, they fucking said that Sub Rosa is one of the strongest episodes, when very clearly, if you look at any fan sites, any ranking of the episode, not just season 7, but all of Next Generation, you will find Sub Rosa in every top 5 worst list. Well, not every, that's an exaggeration. There's always the outliers, but the vast majority of top 5, not just for season 7, but the whole show. Masks and Force of Nature, I'm sure, do show up in some of them, but I guarantee you, especially Force of Nature, probably does not show up like a tiny percentage compared to Sub Rosa. So what in the fuck is Michael Piller talking about? It's funny, because from my perspective, I just did a video last week about Michael Piller and how he's the savior of Star Trek. You probably saw it on my channel a month ago, because by the time I upload this, it would have been out for about a month or so. But even in that video, I pointed out that I don't always agree with Mr. Piller. I still believe that he's an amazing writer, and I still believe that he's the savior of Star Trek. But boy, this is such a shining example of how wrong he is. Well, my mind is blown that he picked Sub Rosa as one of the strong. Now, Pegasus and Parallels and Lower Decks, absolutely. Like, most people will agree, those are like some of the strongest episodes of season 7, but Sub Rosa? And you have the nerve to say, oh, Force of Nature, we're really fucking up here, we really need to change. Really? But Sub Rosa's great? I'm sorry. I still really admire Michael Piller's work, and he, I did mention that, yeah, I don't agree with him on everything. For example, he liked season 4 better than season 3. I like season 3 better than season 4. I think it's very clear. But he said in there that he wasn't present, and he was mostly doing Deep Space Nine. He was kind of hands off. Which is what I mentioned in my video about him. So that quote reaffirms that, but that he got a bit more involved after this episode. And to be fair, the season did pick up after this episode, but I didn't think the season was totally terrible before this episode, because I thought Phantasms was a great episode. I think that's the only great one so far. There was a couple of fine ones, like Gambit, that was fine, and Attached was fine, and Dark Page was really good, actually. That's another really good one. And this one's good too. I'm sorry. It's fun. So I watched, in preparation for this, I watched 6 reviews. I watched or read 6 reviews. And out of 6 of them, 4 of them thought this episode was crap. 1 said it was so-so, and 1 liked it. So I see this as an example of where I'm going to be having a different opinion than most people, because I'm sorry, but I always liked this episode. It's always one of my favorite episodes. I put it when I did my top 50 a couple years ago for TNG. This made it. This was like in the 40s. And I know some people would disagree with that, to say an understatement, and including apparently most of the writing staff, which even Ronald D. Moore was like, oh, I kind of regret this episode where Brennan Braga and Michael Piller were being a lot more harsh on it. I think I didn't read it, but I think there's also a quote of Jerry Taylor also saying that this episode failed. But it's funny to me how sometimes the writers themselves, like Jerry Taylor, still, there's quotes in there of her defending Sub Rosa. And there was another writer, I put the book down, I can't remember his name, who also said it was he saw Gates McFadden. They talked about, oh, thanks for writing Sub Rosa, you did such a good job. So, in other words, a large group of the writers praise Sub Rosa and call it a good episode, which to me kind of makes their opinion a little bit dodgy. I know they wrote the damn things, but still, like, what? I remember seeing an interview with Brennan Braga. I think it was Shuttle Pod with the two actors from Enterprise, Dominic Keaton and Trip, whatever the fuck his name is. I know someone's going to put it in the comments, but I'm sure. Connor Trenier. There, I beat you to it. Connor Trenier. Anyway, I'm pretty sure it was them. I know it was someone and did an interview with Brennan Braga. And no, it wasn't them, actually. I think I'm thinking of someone else, so just scratch that. I can't remember who it was. But someone was interviewing Brennan Braga, and they asked about Sub Rosa. And, like... So how do you feel about... Oh, no, it wasn't... You know what it was? It was like a little conference with... It was like a con type thing, an online con that happened during the pandemic that had a whole bunch of Star Trek writers. It had some from like every show from... I don't think it had anyone from the original series, but it had Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, Discovery, Picard, Lower Decks, like a whole group of various writers, and they were asking all the writers various questions, and the moderator asked Brennan Braga, who was there, specifically about Sub Rosa. Or I think it was one of the other writers of, like, I think the one from Lower Decks was like, oh, you gotta tell me about Sub Rosa. It's so bad, it's brilliant. Like, she's not saying it's a great episode, she's saying it's a terrible episode, but it's so bad it's good episode. And Brennan Braga is just like, look, we can't all, we're writing so many episodes per season, they can't all be winners. But at least, like, they acknowledge that it's looked on like a terrible episode. These freaking people, now granted, these quotes are decades older. Like, Michael Piller sadly passed away, I believe it was 2005 or something like that. It was early 2000s, so almost 20 years ago. So these quotes are old. So maybe at the time they didn't realize how hated this episode Sub Rosa was. So maybe if, like, yeah, like even Brennan Braga admits, like, look, they all can't be winners. We're writing all these episodes per season. But man, I'm sorry to keep talking about Sub Rosa. It just blows my mind that they thought that was a great episode and thought this was the bad episode of the season. Like, okay. But so one thing I will admit, part of the reason why I really love this episode is nostalgia. Flat out. I'll just call it, I'll be honest. I have nostalgia for this episode. I have, I talked about this before. This was the time in my life that I was most obsessed with watching Star Trek. And I have a distinct memory of, like, coming home from a weekend camping trip and, this was recorded. My parents recorded it for me while I was away, and I sat down and watched this episode, and it was with some cocoa or whatever, and it was, like, really great, like, experience that I remembered, and a lot of that probably does color how much I like this episode. But ever since then, I've watched this episode repeatedly, and I'd never, like, changed my mind. I was never like, oh, what the hell was I thinking? This episode actually sucks. I always appreciated it. One of the things I love, and I brought this up when I did my music video, I love the music in this episode, and it's kind of like your stereotypical da, da, like suspense music. But to me, this, like, the explanation point of the music hits, like, the hardest in this episode. Like, when they try to coast into the rift and the Fleming starts his warp drive and fucks everything up and traps the Enterprise in the rift, and then Data says, we no longer have the momentum to get out, and then you hear the music go ja, ja! Like, that gives me chills. It gives me chills. Like, I just love the production value of the way that the music is used, and the rift looks beautiful. And I personally, like, I'll disagree with Mr. Braga there saying that this episode's boring. I don't think it's boring. It is not paced very well. It's got a B plot that kind of goes nowhere and lasts a long time, but it's about cats, so I'll forgive it. But I don't think it's boring. I've always found this episode suspenseful, and maybe it's just me. I know everyone and their mother tends to disagree with me. Well, not everyone, as I said. I found some other people who like this episode, but it seems we're definitely in the minority. I will say that. But yeah, I always loved this episode. So let's get into the cat plot. So it always seemed weird to me, even when I liked this episode when I first saw it. I'm just like, we spend so much time with Spot, especially at the start. It seems like too much time, and then all of a sudden it's kind of dropped and forgotten about, and then the main plot finally kicks in. And I read that they were short, very, very short. And so that first they just brought up, they brought in the scenes with Geordi having his friendly competition. And then that wasn't enough, nearly enough, so they had to make up this other storyline with Spot. Data trying to train Spot. And so it is bad pacing. It is jarring. It's not the best paced episode. It is that B plot does seem like kind of irrelevant, very irrelevant. Now, they link those two side plots thematically. I think the side plot with LaForge competing with the other engineer on the other ship about trying to get the engines just right, I think that actually works very well thematically. I think that slides in perfectly with the main plot. And I got this right away, and I'm like surprised with people who think it doesn't fit in. To me, it's very obvious that they're kind of portraying LaForge as kind of like a gearhead, but instead of with cars, with starships, and how much he admires, the engines, and they're so perfect that he wants to, he's so into it that he's having these nerdy competitions with other engineers about who could get the ratio just the highest, even though it doesn't make any difference. And it just shows how obsessed he is with the engines, which comes into play when he's told his engines are destroying space, and how his first reaction is to gut punch. And I'll get to the analogy later, but I think that's part of why this analogy really works. That to me, because I was around a lot of people who studied climate change and who were very strong climate change activists when I was younger, and one of them even became a ecological scientist. I don't really keep in touch with her anymore, but yeah, I was around those sorts of people, and how they were always up against but I like cars, they're cool. And we see that play out with Geordi. But then Geordi actually, when he's convinced, when he's shown the evidence, he's a smart enough and open-minded enough guy to be like, my God, you're right. These things that I love, that I take so much pride in, are actually causing damage. And how can that be? And what can I do to help? Which speaks very strongly to Geordi's character. I think is a good character story. So I think that side plot is not. I think people who say it's irrelevant are kind of obviously missing the very obvious point. It's not irrelevant at all. It's very relevant, and actually it's really good. It works very well thematically. Now, as for the Spot side plot, yeah, that one you have to do some stretching, some really reaching in order to get it to fit thematically. And how you could get it to fit is that, Spot is a force of nature that you can't control. And just like you can't train Spot, you can't control the force of nature. Yeah. That is such a reach. So, in that regard, yeah, it doesn't really... It's filler. Let's just call it what it is. it is filler. But it's filler that I don't mind. Because it's about cats. It's definitely one of the reasons, I gotta be honest. As you can tell with my intro, I'm a bit upset. I'm a bit of a cat person. But, also, I thought it was a good character story for Geordi and Data. It's actually part of why I like Spot is because it shows the human side of Data. And I love how he is sort of in denial about Spot needing training, and when Geordi comes to see him and asks how's the training going, and Data's like, I have not been totally successful. Like that's very human of him, and I think some people like called that out as like, is he just imitating human behavior? I think partly he is, but I think partly it is him in his own android way being a bit exasperated with trying to train Spot. I actually love that. I love when they do humanize Data. You know me, I keep saying it over and over again, and that's part of the reason why I love the whole Spot thing. And but it's also good. It's good to get these character interactions with Geordi and Data, just having the day-to-day, just having these normal conversations about training a cat and all this, and seeing what their friendship is like in a normal average day. I think that's good character work. I will grant you, as I said, I am granting you this is bad pacing and is obviously filler and it doesn't contribute to the story at all. But it's filler that I like. It's filler that I don't have a problem with. I'm not going to really hold it against the episode because it's good character building. Just for a note, though, this was the first episode where Spot is referred to as a female. Prior to this episode, Spot was referred to as a male. And as recently as the episode Phantasms, which was just a few episodes ago. And so now all of a sudden Spot's a female and she's going to be referred to as a female for the rest of the show. And there's this really nasty fan theory that Data keeps... gets a cat and then it dies and gets another cat and calls all the cats Spot, because in the earlier episode it was like a Siamese cat or something. I hate that fan theory. Data would never do that. It's just a production error, people. Spot's not a shapeshifter. It's just, although she did change into a lizard in another episode. That is something entirely different. But anyway, it's just writers not paying attention to continuity. It happens all the time. You're deluding yourselves if you think it doesn't. But anywho, it's not like some people, this is a sign that there's no continuity in this shit. That is not true. Come on. It's just a minor thing. They don't really care about it. All the major things, there is really great, strong continuity in the show anyway. So let's get into the main plot with the whole rift and the scientists Soroba and Raval or Caval or whatever his name is. Is it Raval? I don't know. Anyway, the scientists that come on board. First of all, we get a Ferengi ship that attacks the Enterprise, and I was just talking about them in the previous episode, which probably aired the same week or the week prior, Rules of Acquisition, about how the Grand Nagus, the leader of the entire fucking people, the entire Ferengi alliance of vast planets that goes across space, is going around traveling in a dinky shuttle that's the size of a closet that can easily be destroyed. Now we get a Ferengi ship that is a match to the Enterprise and threatens them. Well, their leader of the entire line. Okay, I need to let it go, but it's just that bothers me shit ton more than the whole Spot thing. does. But anyway, I do like that the scene with the Ferengi. They're used well here. How he sort of is very threatening to Picard. Like, he threatens, oh, my, government's going to hear about this. And I was like, what, the government that has your leader traveling around? Okay, I said I wouldn't talk about it anymore. Anyway, but I do like the scene with him and Picard where, Picard knows how to talk to Ferengi and negotiate with them. And he wants the logs to the Fleming. And he's like, I'm sorry, our engineers are too busy fixing the repairs. We don't have time to get the logs. It's like, well, what if I sent you a whole team of engineers to help with the repairs? Would that give you enough time to get the logs? He's like, yes, I think it would. Like, and you can tell that the Ferengi was trying to get that from Picard. And I think they both knew it, though. It's like, they're doing the negotiations. I love that. I think that was a nice touch. So, then we meet the two main scientists, and I mentioned that I knew a lot of climate activists, climate change activists when I was younger and met a lot. I've been to a couple of talks when I was at university. And yeah, these guys do remind me a lot. I think they do a really good job of showing for the different aspects of different activists, where you have the extremist who wants to go to the extreme and is very, nothing's getting done and nothing's ever in, very sort of cynical and very like, you're not doing enough and you're not taking this seriously and fuck this, we need to do something extreme in order to get you to listen. And the other side, that's the brother who's a bit more reasonable and it's like, no, well, we can't, we have to expect this, we have to work within the system. And it's easy to dismiss the extremists and be like, especially in this case where she freaking commits suicide, it's easy to dismiss them as, too crazy or too out there, too extreme. But she does have a point that if they dilly-dally and wait too long and just delay, by the time they get to the problem, it's going to be too late. Which, frankly, is pretty much already the case with actual climate change. It's funny because this episode was made in 93 or 94, I think it was. 93, something like that. Anyway, back when, and it's not like, the problem's fixed now. This isn't something we need to worry about. This is worse. Just like the scientists said it would be. And back then, in 93, that's when we could have done something about it. Now, it's here, and we're just trying to minimize the damage and not make it worse than it already is. Which, if it sounds familiar, is exactly what happens in this episode. So I think it's a good allegory. And yeah, so I'm not so easy to dismiss her. I can understand her exasperation because, yeah, she's right that they're not doing enough, that they're waiting too long, and they're making the problem worse. Now, does that mean I agree with her decision to blow herself up and create a rift? No. That was completely idiotic, but I understand her decision. I understand her character, and I sympathize with her. Yeah, that was idiotic to the extreme, not only killing herself when it wasn't really necessary to do so, but also creating the very rift she was hoping to avoid. Now, granted, she did it because to prove that, hey, we need to do something about this now, not fuck around, not have a science vessel come out and do research for another 6 years, now. So she did prove that point, but she made things worse. Like, she created a rift that already started to affect her planet, like, immediately. So, making the problem worse in order to get people to do stuff about it now, I don't think the trade-off is worth it. So, yeah, it was dumb, and she shouldn't have done that, but I buy that character. And I understand that character, and I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's a good character. And I like how the brother... I think this is... So this is another reason why I don't think this episode's boring. Because I buy the interpersonal relationship between her and her brother, and I think the scenes we get with her brother after she dies and how affected he is, like, I think it was a really nice touch that is right immediately after she died and a rift is formed. Picard turns to him as the only expert on the situation that they know of and asks him about the rift, and he's just shocked. He just can't move, can't speak, and Picard has to like snap him out of it and be like, look, I'm sorry for your loss, but this is an emergency situation, we need your help. And then so he's like, oh, I don't know. But he does everything he can to help Data and to research it. But I love that moment of just how shocked and horrified he just saw his sister blow herself up. And that was powerful. And again, the music. Oh, the music was so damn good when you go dun dun dun, the rift explodes. I think that was beautiful special effects. That rift looks beautiful as well. It was just an amazing scene. Like, it gives me goosebumps. Like, I think it's a really, really good scene. And then seeing his interactions with Geordi and Data afterwards, where he tries to be more tactful with Geordi, but you can tell just, and Geordi also is a bit apologetic. Like, I'm sorry, this happened. And it was great, like, seeing their interpersonal interactions and how they interact with each other. So yeah, and then I already talked about how once we get into the escape rescue, and I've heard some people say, who are a bit more harsh on this episode than I am, that they don't give a shit about the Fleming because we don't see the ship, we don't see any of the people on board. So why should we care about it? And to be fair, a small part of me agrees with that. A small part of me thought that when I first saw this episode. It's like, I would actually care more about this if we actually saw the people on board. But that money, gotta build another set. Well, granted, they could redress the set of the Enterprise and say it's another ship, but still, that's still money, and then had to create a model of the ship and all this thing. So I'm not gonna complain too much about it. Like, would it be nice? Yes. Would it help me get more involved with the storyline? Yes. Does it completely ruin it that we don't see it? No, not at all. I disagree. I think that in the large scheme of things, it's not entirely necessary to see them. If they had this scene they saw the people on the Fleming going like, oh no, we're in this rift, how do we get out? The scene actually would have been kind of superfluous. It kind of would have been unnecessary. Now, granted, this episode has a lot of unnecessary scenes about Spot, so it could have fit in an unnecessary scene that actually helped flesh out this crisis and get you to identify with it more, but the scenes with Spot didn't cost that much money. Plus, they would have to hire the guest stars to come on board just for one scene. Like, I get why they didn't do it, but would it have been nice? Sure, I agree. But does it ruin the episode? Absolutely not. It doesn't at all. But anyway, because I was still invested. Like, even though I didn't see the ship or anything, that's pretty much all you need to know. There's a medical ship in danger, there's people in danger, and Enterprise needs to go in and get them out. And they decide to do the thing where they coast with warp drive, which honestly is how warp drive should always work, because there's no resistance in space. I saw a meme about this. Like, you shouldn't have to have the engines on the whole time. You should just, all you need is a burst, and it will just keep traveling at that speed, because it's space. But anyway, this is Star Trek. It's a sci-fi fantasy show. I've been saying this forever. People don't believe me. It absolutely is one. But anyway, so that doesn't bother me. I'll go with the conceits of the show, of this fantasy show. These are the rules this fantasy show set up. So they coast in. they try to get it, but the Fleming, the idiots, don't know what's going on, and they set the warp drive. And I think, yeah, that really raised the stakes. And I remember my heart beating really fast when Data's like, we can't get out. And I was, and the music comes in. Like, I love that. Like, I was on the edge of my seat. It was good stuff. And then, of course, they do the surfing thing, and they get out, and then they have the speed limit, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so let me now tackle the whole analogy thing. The quote I read earlier that said this was a fastball. It clobbers you over the head. And I watched a review of this episode that was so bold to say that Star Trek is always at its best when it doesn't clobber you over the head with its allegory. And I disagree. First of all, I disagree that Star Trek doesn't clobber you over the head with its allegory. It does that a lot. Let that be your last battlefield is the biggest and most cited example of this, but not the only one. There's also past tense as another example. And, God, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I know. I mean, Symbiosis is kind of one. The whole, don't do drugs, kids, and talk that Yar has, although people put that episode down for that. But I actually really like that episode, minus that Yar and Wesley scene, which rightfully is made fun of. But the rest of the episode is really good. And yeah, no, you have other episodes that are quite plain with I think Duet is probably an example. Like that does not shy away from the allegory that it's making. Like, that clobbers you over the head, and that's a fucking masterpiece. So, one, I disagree that Star Trek doesn't clobber you over the head with the message. It does that all the fucking time. And two, that's not always a bad thing, especially in the case of Duet. Come on. And Past Tense is an amazing episode too. Clobbering you over the head with a message is not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on how you do it. In some cases, yeah, it can be like Picard Season 2, for example. Ooh, sorry, I had a knee-jerk reaction just by mentioning that out of nowhere. I shouldn't do that to myself. But that's an example of clobbering you over the head in a bad way, because it doesn't actually portray that message in a meaningful way, and the story completely sucks, and it's a giant dumpster fire, and I should stop talking about it before my blood pressure goes through the roof. But a lot of cases you can clobber people over the head with the meaning and it be really good. Now, is this episode as good as Duet? Obviously not. Come on. But to me, it is another example of clobbering you over the head with the message, but doing it in a good way. I think the way it discusses climate change, as I said, feels really true to the message. Like, people are resistance. The whole thing is like, because you're attacking someone's way of life. I mean, that's what people do when they say, oh, we should drive less, or we should drive not different types of cars, or we should rely less on oil. Like, a lot of people depend on oil. A lot of people depend on automobiles. A lot of people love automobiles. And so, I don't know why I'm saying automobiles instead of cars. But so people are going to be, there's going to be a natural, overwhelming resistance to it. Like, and so they're not going to want to believe your science because, and as we know, there's plenty of people out there who flat out deny it to this day. Many people who are in fucking government. And because, sorry to coin a phrase, but because it's inconvenient for them, because, well, it's more than just inconvenient, it attacks their whole way of life. And that's what this episode's dealing with. But because we have our heroes who are enlightened, run various visions of a bright future, they're able to see past that eventually. Like, but I love how LaForge is resistant. He has that same fuck you, I love warp drive resistance at first, until he's shown the proof, shown the evidence, and then he's like, oh my god, what was I doing? And Picard, that speech that Picard gives is like, I've been destroying the thing that I love. Like, that was powerful. I love that. I think this is a great allegory for climate change. I think it's amazing, and people should. These writers are wrong. Sorry, but they are. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Finally, the warp speed limit that is promptly forgotten about. So it's mentioned in 2 other episodes, Pegasus, and I believe, was it Thine Own Self or Eye of the Beholder? I think it's Eye of the Beholder. And then never mentioned ever again, completely forgotten about Voyager, Deep Space Nine. They go maximum warp all the fucking time, don't give a shit. Yeah, I read a book, a Star Trek book that came out like around this time that looked kind of interesting, but it was actually really boring. Most of it was about them trying to get permission to go above the speed limit, but there was like these bureaucrats who were fucking around and not doing it because there's a bureaucratic thing and they had to deal with the bureaucrats and they were just being lazier and refusing to give them permission to go past warp 5. So that's such a stupid story. One, Federation's more evolved to beyond those kind of bureaucratic bullshit. It was definitely written by a libertarian. And 2, Picard would just go past, if this happened where their bureaucrats were not giving him permission to go past Warp 5, he would fucking do it anyway. What they gonna do? Like, give him a fine? Yeah, because we've established that Picard and the Enterprise are pretty much on their own. I mean, they have to answer the admirals, whatever, but if they want to do something, they can just do it and ask for forgiveness. We see that so many times. So that book was dumb. I didn't even finish it. And also it had to do with Wesley playing poker or something, which is really boring. But anyway, so other than that book, we only get a couple mentions in actual canon, and then it's completely forgotten about. And apparently it was written in the technical manual for Voyager that the reason why Voyagers and cells go up and down is because they came up with new technology that allowed the ships to go to high warp without hurting the space or whatever. So they overcame it with technology. But that was never said in actual canon, just to be clear. It was just a fucking technical manual. It wasn't said in the actual show. And besides, we've seen plenty of, like, Voyager's the only one that had nacelles go up and down. We have seen plenty of ships that don't do that. But maybe they just were able to create, But, I wish they had that's all they had to do was just say it in canon. Just have some line thrown in Deep Space Nine. Oh, yeah, thank God we have these nacelles that no longer harm space, whatever, so now we can go as fast as we want, blah, blah, blah. That's all you need to do. Done. And it's funny, like, reading that quote from Ronald D. Moore, who was like, we're going to change the Star Trek universe. Yeah, that was very naive of him. And he realizes that. I can tell in the later part of the quote. He's like, yeah, what was I thinking? Like, obviously they're not going to do that. Obviously they're not going to have people be like, oh, we got to get permission to go past Warp 5. like, that's just going to, like... This is going to slowly... It's unnecessary. So I'm thinking it was the most obvious thing in the world that the future episodes would just ignore this. I am not the least bit surprised, and therefore I'm not that upset about it. Some people are like, oh, this is such a... they said this Warp 5 and they never follow up on it. This episode sucks. I'm like, no, the episode doesn't suck. It still stands on its own. I mean, it was the most obvious thing in the world that they shouldn't have tried to set the standard for this warp speed, because very obviously it's not going to keep up. And I knew that when I first saw this episode. I'm like, yeah, right, they're going to stick to that. And they didn't. And I wasn't surprised and I wasn't upset. It's fine. It's whatever. Yeah, they shouldn't have done it, but does it ruin the episode? No. You can do your headcanon to do what the fucking technical manual said, that they came up with new technology that didn't hurt warp drive. Done. Problem solved. Now, granted, that kind of undercuts the whole climate change analogy, because it's not as easily fixed as that, but You do what you gotta do to keep... It's a fucking fictional show where they travel through space. You can't put limits on that. And also, some people point out that the whole, space is vast kind of thing. That, even if it did wear and tear on the space, that it's so vast that it shouldn't actually make that big of a difference, or shouldn't make any difference whatsoever. But those things take into account, I don't care. I think this is a good analogy and a good episode. So, I would now like to thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon, especially when you disagree with me very much, like I know many of you are going to with this episode, but that's okay. I still very much appreciate your support, even more so appreciate your support. And so I'd like to give a big special thanks to Brandon Neilhouse and Antarius. Thank you so much for your strong support. Very much appreciated. And I would like to give a shout out to Benjamin Mead, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Migalicio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So we have a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who said, I like this episode. However, only mention the warp energy is weakening the fabric of space one more time is the worst thing ever in the Star Trek franchise. I agree with you that Picard and Nella Darren should have got married, and Miles O'Brien in Hard Time, and of course Data's daughter Lal. I don't really mind that a lot of things they were never followed up on. Why is the warp thingy the worst thing ever? Every episode of Trek has the main cast and the starship as a standard thing. Space is a major factor of all of Trek, and to drop it after one more episode is an insult. So my rating is 7 Geordie I Cannot Stun My Cat out of 10. I guess, matter of perspective, I don't think it's a big deal that they dropped it. I knew that they would, and they kind of have to. And they can just make up some bullshit. We have some warp drive compensators to make it so it doesn't stay in space. Done. Anyway, you can headcanon that even though it's not in the show, so it doesn't really bother me. But that's just me. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, I appreciate that they tried to make an episode about environmental activism and environmental effects. This is now even more relevant than it was back then. They tried but failed to create a compelling story out of the idea the solution of imposing the restrictions is okay, but instead of ignoring it after a short time, they could at least have mentioned that there's now some new warp drive configuration that is not damaging the space anymore. The story about Spot was okay, but the story about Geordie's rivalry with the intrepid chief engineer made him look very nerdy again. All in all, the episode is rather slow and features a lot of technobabble. Maybe I missed something, but why weren't they able to leave the rift by impulse drive? My rating is 5 out of 10. So I'll address the impulse drive thing, because someone else brought this up. And the answer is they did mention that the rift spread across light years. And impulse drive is, you cannot understate how much slower impulse drive is compared to warp drive. Like, they said it would take them 3 weeks to get to the rift in impulse drive. It took them 2 seconds to get there on warp 1. So, yeah, it was too far away to travel with impulse drive. They would never make it. Done. Answer that question. But as far as let's see, they failed to create the solution imposing the restrictions okay, but ignoring it after a short time, they could at least have mentioned it. I agree that they could have mentioned it. It would have been nice if they mentioned there was a new warp configuration. Just a line of dialogue, that's all you need. So I do agree with you there. And you're right, the rivalry does make Geordi look nerdy, but I don't know, they always do that. As I said, I think it works thematically for the... and it makes him not necessarily nerdy, though. It can make him look like a gearhead. Like, gearheads aren't seen as nerdy. But I don't know, he's using a lot of technobabble, so yeah, that does make him look nerdy. But still, I think it works. Alright, so next comment is from Brandon Neal Howells, who says, "Whose stupid idea was this? My first thought on rewatching this garbage was, thank God Voyager wasn't in the vicinity of the Harkonius corridor, because that ship encounters so many anomalies on a regular basis. I'm not sure whose jurisdiction the Harkonius corridor is under, which makes the Federation Council deciding to render judgment problematic, maybe illegal. The Ferengi demon is never named in dialogue. I had to look up in Memory Alpha to find out that Rabal, that's his name, Rabal, and Sarova belong to the Harkonian species. Why are there no holodeck or computer simulations to find the Fleming and fix the subspace rift? We never see the Fleming or any of its crew, so why should I care about their fate? I have a theory that Sarova destroyed her ship and herself because she couldn't bear wearing those hideous ruffled clothes anymore." I can always count on you, Brandon, to point out terrible wardrobe. Is it just me, or did anyone else find Data's lacking in intelligence in this episode? Maybe he was too busy concentrating on his pussy. Bad one. Brandon, that's bad. Oh yeah, and Geordi has a dick measuring contest with the chief engineer of the Intrepid, which reminds me of the animosity between Sisko and Solok and Take Me Out to the Holosuite. I thought biomimetic gel was illegal. Too many of the bridge crew are fake shaking when the Enterprise is trying to escape the rift. Jonathan Frakes looks particularly bored. The medical transport USS Fleming is named after Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin in 1928. My father was allergic to penicillin, which is how I feel about this episode. 2 surfing ships out of 10. There we go, 2 out of 10. Fair enough, though. So, yeah, Alexander Fleming, the person who discovered penicillin. I did learn that from this episode, and it helped me out when I was playing a trivia game once. I knew the answer to the trivia question. Now, as far as biomimetic gel, it's illegal to sell it, but like Starfleet uses it for internal uses. Like, it's not illegal for Starfleet to use it, but it's a controlled substance. It's like having like rocket fuel or something that can be made into bombs. Like, the military still uses it, but they don't sell it to civilians, and they want to make sure it doesn't get out to the black market, which is the case with biomimetic gel, which is why Bashir was outraged when Sisko, he didn't know where this highly, volatile substance was going to. He needed to know exactly where it was, and when Sisko refused to tell him, that's why he put his freaking complaint in writing. But anyway, so, and they mentioned that in this episode, that this is that's why they think maybe the Ferengi attacked the Fleming, because they had biomimetic gel and that it could be sought after in the black market. So they did. This episode is true to it. What's not true to it is a Voyager episode when they casually trade biomimetic gel to some random aliens in the Delta Quadrant. Now that's fucked up. But here, this is actually consistent. With In the Pale Moonlight, which won't be written for several years from when this episode was made. But anyway, it's still consistent. Where else are we? Makes the Federation... Oh, so they did mention in this episode that the Harkonius corridor was set up by the Federation. Established by the Federation. So to me, that implies it's in Federation space or considered Federation space. And that planet that those, Sarova and Rabal are from is part of the Federation. They never state that, to be fair, but I think that's the implication that I got. So, yeah, it makes total sense that they can put a restriction on the corridor. And plus, the Federation runs it. Anyway, so I don't think it's illegal at all. Let's see. Was there another point that you made that I wanted to address? Dick measuring contest? Yeah, sure. But I think that's kind of the point. And it doesn't remind me of Cisco and Solok and Take Me Out to the Holosuite. That was much worse. That was more of a... This was just like a friendly rivalry. I can get it up by 0.27. Where the Cisco and Saval thing was like... it was like a whole like thing. And like they despised each other and they had to prove each other wrong by playing baseball. God, that episode sucked. Don't remind me of it. In other words, I don't think it's anywhere near as bad. But that is just me. Yeah. So, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, in a way, this episode should resonate all the more. When the episode premiered, the issue was the harms of phenomenon known as greenhouse effect on our general environment and creating harm, including concerns of the ozone layer. 3 decades later, we've dealt with global warming and then climate change, and many years after Al Gore showed effectively the dramatic trends of where harmful effects are happening on our environment and the growing number of storms, hurricanes, damaging brush fires, etc. that make us all the more conscious. And with almost all scientists on board, this is a truthful phenomenon, and yet these earlier versions of what mass media called eco-terrorists seems to come across with the stereotype of being whiny, and where many watchers do not seem to give a damn when the sister dies like she's yet another red shirt. Part of the problem is what happens after this episode. Outside of something I was told, I don't recall from the episode itself, where Voyager is supposed to have a newer type of warp core engine that is cleaner and does not give harmful effects to an even more controversial. This claim may turn out to be a hoax, as stated in the episode in Lower Decks. I don't know what to make of it. In a way, the treatment of this episode back in the day from some fans reminds me of woke complaining these days. But here's the thing: I don't think it was a great written episode. Add to a B story with Geordi and Data, mainly talking about Spot. I understand clearly why this episode is on the skip list. Maybe this script simply needed another draft or two, and maybe add more complexity to the siblings, maybe throw in an ignorant Admiral that tests even a skeptical Picard. I don't know. So I'll give this episode a blah 3 out of 10. Alright, so... very symbolic or representative, I should say, of the reviews I saw in this episode. I totally hated it, so not unexpected. Obviously, I disagree with your ultimate claim. I actually think this was a good way to tackle the topic of climate change, and I think that I personally identified with Sarova. I was affected when she killed herself, even when I first saw this episode back in the day, and I'm still affected by it when I watch this episode. Part of it is due to the great music in this episode, but I get the relationship between the brother and sister. And in fact, as I said, I love the scenes with the brother afterwards. It makes me sort of emotional. You can feel how upset he is at her death. Now, the whole thing with eco-terrorists, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say that they don't exist, but there's such an a minority and such a rare occurrence, they might as well not exist. And I remember watching in the 2000s, my parents were watching NCIS, and it had this really the bad guys were these eco-terrorists who were blowing up military submarines, and the poor military were getting destroyed by the evil environmentalists. And that is fucking environmental propaganda if I've ever seen it. And so I have a knee-jerk reaction when I hear the term eco-terrorist. That is just propaganda. They might as well not exist. Do some activists take it too far? Of course, you have that in any cause, but it's such a minor occurrence, it's not even worth mentioning. And the reason why these fucking shows would mention it is because they want to demonize all environmentalists, particularly the NCIS thing. I don't think this episode does that. I don't get that impression that they're portraying her. You can interpret her actions as an eco-terrorist. I don't. She is desperate and kills herself, not anyone else. She puts the Fleming in danger, but which is kind of reckless of her, but I still wouldn't call her an eco-terrorist. They put the things, they mine the quarter, and they disable ships, but she even points out that no one was hurt. So she's a bit reckless. I will grant you that, but I wouldn't go as far as to call her a terrorist. But that is just my humble opinion. Anyway, thank you, patrons, so much for your thoughts. So my rating for Force of Nature out of 10 is going to be an 8. Extremely good. I'm sorry. Giving it an 8. I only gave Move Along Home a 6, but this I'm giving it an 8. So I even fight back even stronger against this one. I stand by my 8. And I'm just reaffirmed after talking about it and talking through the episode. And I think a lot is probably nostalgia, to be fair, because I always liked this episode. It is bad pacing. The B plot goes on for too long, doesn't go anywhere. But as I said, I still like it because it's about Spot, which is not just because I like cats, but because it's a good I love the character stuff they do with Data and Geordi. I think it's great. Is it good pacing? No, absolutely not. But I still like it. Doesn't bother me. And I think the competition Geordi has with the other engineer actually dovetails very nicely into the main plot and actually reinforces it. And the main plot, I think, for me, was very exciting. Brought in 2 very interesting characters who I identified with, who I was emotionally involved with, and the music ties it all together and sells it for me. So I'm going as far as an 8 for this episode. Fight me if you want to, but that is where I stand. So anyway, that is it for my review of Force of Nature. Be sure to check out my channel as I continue to cover Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. If you enjoyed this video and weren't too upset over my minority opinion, you can leave a like, leave a comment. It would help out the channel a lot. And if you'd really like to support me, you can support me on Patreon. Consider that. In the comments, in the description below will be a link to my Patreon page. There's different tiers for different budgets, different rewards, such as Patreon-only series videos that I do exclusive to Patreon, where I revisit reviews that I've already done, and pre-releases where I released videos 2 weeks in advance, and you can request a video for me to do. You can make comments on an episode that I'll read in my video, that kind of thing, if you'd like. No pressure. If you can, if you'd like to, if you so desire, you can check it out. Otherwise, leaving a like, subscribe, all those things also really very much appreciate it. So let's see what's coming up next on my channel. Where are we at now? So Thursday will be my review for Lower Decks Season 5, Episode 5. Saturday, I'll be over on Patreon doing one of those exclusive Patreon videos, revisiting my review for Necessary Evil. Monday, I'll be back on my main channel to review Inheritance, Data's Mommy. And Wednesday, reviewing the wonderful episode of Second Sight. So that's what's coming up on my channel, so be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and many other shows as well, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.